What decision did your parents completely regret? My parents put a lock on our kitchen that activated at 10 every night because they said my midnight snacking was out of control and costing them hundreds in grocery bills. I really didn't think I was eating that much, and I even warned them this was a bad idea. They didn't believe me until the first night with the lock. Our washing machine flooded the entire laundry room and basement. You see, I usually grabbed leftover pizza at 11:30, which was exactly when it would make that weird grinding noise. I'd been, without knowing, kicking it back and resetting something inside it every night. Without my foot, the machine ripped the water line completely out of the wall, pumping hundreds of gallons directly onto Mom's collection of first edition books she stored in the basement. The next day, our neighbor Jerry broke into our garage at 2 in the morning and stole Dad's riding mower plus all his power tools worth $8,000. I always caught Jerry creeping around when I went for my usual bowl of cereal at 2:15 because I could see the garage from the kitchen window. This time nobody saw him, and he had 4 hours to clean us out. My grandma lived with us and had started sleepwalking recently. I'd always caught her when she wandered through the kitchen trying to get outside. Without me there eating string cheese, she walked straight out the front door in her nightgown and made it 6 blocks before a cop found her trying to break into an elementary school because she thought it was her childhood home. The officer brought her back at 4 in the morning, and CPS started asking questions about elderly neglect. I mentioned to my parents that maybe the lock wasn't working out, but they said this was about teaching me discipline and boundaries. My mom said your grandmother is fine, and she just needs better medication, and the insurance will cover the flooding, and Jerry would have robbed us eventually anyway, while Dad installed motion sensors to make sure I wasn't picking the lock. Our cat Mustard always came to the kitchen around midnight, and I'd let him out because otherwise he'd pee on everything in protest. With the kitchen locked, he destroyed Mom's $30,000 Persian rug that had been in her family for 5 generations, and then shredded Dad's leather recliner into confetti. The smell of cat pee became so overwhelming, we had to replace all the living room furniture and tear out the hardwood floors because the urine had soaked through to the subfloor. But things got worse when I wasn't there to notice the gas leak from our stove at midnight, like I did every few weeks when the pilot light went out. The house filled with gas all night, and when Dad went to start his car in the morning, the tiny spark from the garage door opener literally blew out every window in our house, and the neighbors called Homeland Security, thinking it was a terrorist attack. We had to live in a hotel for 2 weeks while hazmat teams verified our house was safe for human habitation. My parents still refused to remove the lock and actually added a second one plus a chain because they thought I'd somehow caused the gas leak on purpose to prove a point. My dad said this is about your health and learning to respect boundaries, even if it means dealing with some minor inconveniences while writing a check for $20,000 in home repairs. Without my late-night presence, nobody heard the pipes burst in the walls at 3 in the morning during a cold snap, and water poured through the electrical system, causing a fire that destroyed half our house. I also wasn't there to accidentally interrupt the raccoon family that had started opening our windows from the outside and inviting themselves in to raid the pantry. They established a whole colony in our attic and had babies, and the exterminator said it was the worst infestation he'd seen in 30 years of business. Grandma's sleepwalking escalated, and she somehow got the car keys and drove to the airport where TSA found her trying to board a plane to Dubai with no passport or ticket. She told them she was meeting her deceased husband for lunch, and they placed her on a federal watch list. The house became basically unlivable between the fire damage and raccoon feces and toxic mold from the flooding and cat urine soaked into every surface. My parents finally called a family meeting where they admitted defeat and said they were removing the kitchen lock immediately. My dad said we need you to go back to your normal routine right now, while Mom sobbed into her hands. He said this house is about to collapse and we're going bankrupt and Grandma might end up in federal prison. I grabbed the key and headed to unlock the kitchen, but stopped when I saw something through the window that made my blood freeze. Jerry was in our driveway with 5 other guys loading everything we owned into a moving truck while our house burned behind them. I said, "Mom, Dad, you need to call 911 right now." Dad grabbed his phone and punched in 911, while Mom ran to get Grandma from her room, and I kept watching Jerry through the window. The dispatcher answered immediately, and Dad started yelling about our house being on fire and people stealing our stuff at the same time. She told him to get everyone out of the house right away and stay clear of the property because units were already responding to multiple fire calls in our area. Mom came back dragging Grandma by the arm, and we all rushed out the front door onto the sidewalk where the heat from the fire hit us like opening an oven door. Jerry and his crew must have heard the sirens getting closer because they started throwing things into the truck way faster than before. Luther Perry grabbed our flat-screen TV and tried to run with it, but dropped it right on the driveway where it shattered into a million pieces. They were panicking now and just tossing whatever they could grab into the back of the truck without even looking at what it was. Kaya Perry was dragging Mom's antique dresser across the lawn when the first siren got really loud and close. They all jumped in the truck at once, leaving half our stuff scattered across the front yard, including Dad's tool chest that spilled open with wrenches and screwdrivers everywhere. The truck peeled out so fast it left black tire marks on our driveway and almost hit our mailbox on the way out. 3 fire trucks came screaming around the corner just as the flames broke through the roof, sending sparks and burning pieces of shingles flying everywhere. The firefighters jumped out and immediately started pulling hoses and spraying water, but the fire chief walked over to us, shaking his head. He said the house was probably a total loss, given how long it had been burning and how much of the structure was already compromised. 2 police cars pulled up right behind the fire trucks, and an officer came over asking if we were the homeowners. I told him about Jerry and the other guys I saw loading our stuff into the truck. I said I recognized the Perry brothers from the neighborhood because Luther used to mow lawns and Colson worked at the gas station down the street. The officer grabbed his radio and called it in right away, giving descriptions of Jerry and the Perry brothers and which direction the truck went. Mom looked at our burning house and then at all our stuff thrown around the yard and just completely lost it. She fell to her knees on the sidewalk, crying so hard she couldn't even talk, while Dad just stood there staring at the flames with this blank look on his face. His mouth was hanging open a little, and his eyes weren't blinking, and I don't think his brain could process that everything we owned was either stolen or burning. The fire chief came back over and asked how long the house might have been burning before we noticed. I explained we were all in a family meeting in the living room talking about the kitchen lock, and I only saw the fire when I went to unlock the kitchen and looked out the window. That meant it could have been burning for an hour or maybe even longer without anyone knowing. Grandma kept pulling on Mom's sleeve, asking why there were so many pretty lights and saying she wanted to go back inside to get her purse. Mom had to physically hold her back and keep explaining over and over that the house was on fire and we couldn't go inside, but Grandma would forget after 30 seconds and try to walk toward the house again. Our neighbors started coming out of their houses to watch, and a bunch of them came over with blankets and bottles of water. The family from across the street said they saw the moving truck earlier, but thought we were just getting rid of old furniture because of all the damage from before. They had no idea someone was robbing us while the house burned. More neighbors kept showing up, and someone brought folding chairs for Mom and Grandma to sit in while we watched the firefighters work. The water from the hoses was making huge clouds of steam and smoke that drifted across the whole neighborhood. About 20 minutes later, one of the officers came back over with a big smile on his face. He said they found Jerry's crew just 2 miles away because their overloaded truck broke down right on the highway exit ramp. Colson Perry was driving, and the truck was so heavy with all our stuff that the transmission just gave out completely. They still had most of our things in the back, including Dad's power tools and Mom's jewelry box that had her grandmother's wedding ring. The officer said they arrested all 6 guys on the spot and were bringing the truck back so we could identify our property. We spent the rest of that night at the police station going through everything and giving statements about what happened. The detective assigned to our case was this older guy with gray hair who kept shaking his head while taking notes. He said with the fire and theft happening at the same time, this was now a major felony investigation involving arson and organized crime charges. Even though Jerry didn't set the fire, the detective explained that committing a felony during another crime made him responsible for everything that happened. They had us look at photos of all the guys they arrested to confirm identities and write down everything we saw them take. The detective finished taking our statements around 3 in the morning and called the Red Cross to help us find somewhere to stay since our house was still smoking and covered in crime scene tape. A volunteer showed up with vouchers for a motel about 10 minutes from our neighborhood and drove us there in a van that smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies. The motel room had 2 beds and a broken air conditioner that made clicking noises every few seconds. All 4 of us had to share the space with Grandma, taking one bed while Mom and Dad squeezed into the other, and I got the floor with a blanket the Red Cross lady gave me. Grandma woke up every couple hours asking where we were and trying to leave because she wanted to go home and feed her cats that died 15 years ago. Mom had to keep getting up to guide her back to bed and explain over and over that we were in a motel because our house burned down, but Grandma would forget within minutes and start getting dressed again. The next morning, someone knocked on our door, and when Dad opened it, there was this guy in a cheap suit, holding a clipboard and a briefcase. He said his name was Harry Vickers from the insurance company, and he needed to ask us some questions about the fire and all the other claims we'd filed recently. Harry sat at the little table by the window and started going through this huge list of every single thing that had gone wrong at our house in the past month. He kept raising his eyebrows and making little humming sounds while he wrote notes about the flooded basement and the gas explosion and the raccoon infestation and the cat pee damage. When he got to the part about the fire happening during a robbery, he actually put his pen down and stared at us like we were criminals ourselves. Dad tried to pay for breakfast at the diner next door, but his credit card got declined because he'd maxed it out on the hotel stays from the gas explosion and paying contractors to fix the water damage. The waitress stood there tapping her foot while Dad tried 3 different cards that all got rejected, and finally Mom had to call her sister in Ohio to wire us money through Western Union just so we could eat and buy clean underwear. Mom's sister kept asking questions about how things got so bad, and Mom started crying right there in the Western Union while the clerk pretended not to notice. We went back to the house later that day to meet with the fire investigator, who introduced herself as Gianna Royce, and had us wait outside while she examined the burned sections with some kind of special equipment. She came out after 2 hours, with soot on her face, and showed us pictures on her tablet of wires that looked melted and twisted inside the walls. Gianna explained that water from the burst pipes had gotten into the electrical system weeks ago and corroded everything until the wires basically cooked themselves and started the fire. She said we were lucky the whole house didn't burn down a month ago, considering how bad the damage was, and wrote in her report that it was caused by a cascade of previous incidents. The prosecutor called Dad's cell phone that afternoon to explain the charges against Jerry and his crew. Even though Jerry didn't actually start the fire himself, he was charged with arson along with grand theft and conspiracy because the fire happened while he was committing a felony, which made him responsible for everything. The prosecutor said Jerry was looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted and asked if we'd be willing to testify at the trial. We were sitting in the motel room eating gas station sandwiches when someone knocked, and it was a social worker from Child Protective Services with a folder full of papers. Someone had called them about an elderly person living in unsafe conditions, and she needed to investigate whether Grandma was being properly cared for. Mom had to explain our whole situation, while the social worker took pictures of the motel room and asked Grandma questions that she couldn't answer because she thought the social worker was her dead sister. The social worker wrote everything down and said she'd be checking in regularly to make sure Grandma was safe and getting proper care. A detective called the next day to tell us they'd found a storage unit Luther Perry had been renting that was packed with stolen stuff from 12 different families in our neighborhood. Jerry's crew had been breaking into houses for months and taking everything valuable while people were at work or on vacation. The detective said they recovered televisions and jewelry and power tools, and even someone's collection of rare coins worth $50,000. They needed all the victims to come identify their property and fill out more paperwork for evidence. Grandma's doctor made us bring her in for an emergency appointment because the stress was making her confusion worse, and she'd started forgetting who we were. He sat us down in his office and said Grandma needed to be in a memory care facility immediately because we couldn't properly care for her in a motel room. Dad argued that we couldn't afford it since memory care cost $8,000 a month, but the doctor said keeping her in our current situation was dangerous, and he'd have to report it if we didn't find appropriate care. 3 days later, Harry Vickers called to say the insurance company was denying our claim because we'd had too many incidents in too short a time, which indicated negligence on our part. He actually suggested we might have caused some of the damage intentionally to collect insurance money, which made Dad so mad he punched a hole in the motel room wall. Now we owed the motel $200 for the wall repair on top of everything else. I pulled out my phone and told Harry I had something to show him. For the past month, I'd been taking pictures and writing notes every single time something went wrong, and every time I warned my parents about problems. I had screenshots of text messages where I told them the kitchen lock was a bad idea, and videos of me pointing out the washing machine noise, and the gas smell, and Jerry creeping around at night. I showed Harry timestamps proving I'd documented everything, including a voice memo where I recorded myself telling my parents that preventing my midnight snacking would cause disasters they couldn't predict. Harry stared at my phone for a long time and then asked if I could email him all the files, which took me 20 minutes because there were so many photos and videos and text messages. Mom spent the whole morning calling every hotel in town, trying to find one that would take pets so we could get mustard out of the boarding place that was charging us $60 a day. She finally found this sketchy extended stay place 40 minutes away that said they allowed cats for an extra $100 deposit, and we drove there immediately to check in. The room smelled like cigarettes and the carpet had stains everywhere, but at least we could bring Mustard home, and within 10 seconds of putting him down, he peed right in the middle of the floor. The manager came up 5 minutes later and said we'd lost our deposit, and if it happened again, we'd be kicked out, and Mom just sat on the bed, holding her head in her hands. That afternoon, a detective called and said Luther and Colson and Kaya Perry had all agreed to testify against Jerry in exchange for reduced charges, and they'd given the police recordings from their phones. Luther had actually recorded Jerry planning the whole thing 2 weeks before it happened, where Jerry talked about how our house was falling apart, and we'd be easy targets because we were distracted. The recording had Jerry saying he knew about the kitchen lock, and how it meant I wasn't watching the garage at night anymore, and he'd been waiting for the perfect time to rob us. Colson had texts where Jerry promised them each $2,000 from selling our stuff, and threatened to hurt their mom if they didn't help him. Dad had to call his boss that same day to say he needed more time off to deal with the police and insurance, and finding contractors to assess the house damage. His boss was nice about it at first, but then started asking how much longer this would take, and mentioned that the quarterly reports were due, and they really needed Dad back in the office. Dad promised he'd work from the hotel room, but then the next call came from the contractor, who needed to walk through the house immediately, and Dad had to leave again. We drove to see Grandma at the care facility the social worker had placed her in temporarily, and she was sitting in the common room staring at the wall. When we walked in, she looked right at me and called me Tommy, which was her brother who died in 1987, and kept asking when I was taking her dancing like we used to. Mom tried to explain who we were, but Grandma just got more confused and started crying because she didn't understand why strangers were bothering her. The nurse said this was normal for her condition, and the stress of everything had made her dementia progress faster than expected, and she might never fully recognize us again. 2 days later, the insurance company called and said they'd assigned a new adjuster named Sarah, who wanted to review everything from the beginning with fresh eyes. She came to the hotel and spent 3 hours going through every document and photo, and actually found something the first adjuster missed completely. The contractor who'd fixed the water damage from the first flood had never properly sealed the walls, and the moisture had been spreading through the electrical system for weeks before the fire. Sarah said this was contractor negligence, and it actually strengthened our claim, because it proved we hadn't caused the damage ourselves, and the insurance would have to cover more than they originally thought. Jerry's lawyer called the next morning saying Jerry wanted to make a deal where he'd plead guilty to lesser charges and pay us $50,000 in restitution over 10 years. Dad wanted to take it because we needed money desperately, but Mom started yelling that Jerry belonged in prison for what he'd done to our family. They fought about it for an hour, with Dad saying we couldn't afford to be stubborn, and Mom saying some things were more important than money, and she wanted Jerry to pay for destroying our lives. I decided to set up a GoFundMe page explaining everything that had happened, starting with the kitchen lock and how it led to our house burning down while being robbed. Within 3 hours, it had been shared 200 times, and people started donating $5 here and $20 there, and someone anonymous gave $1,000. By the third day, we'd raised $15,000, and people were dropping off bags of clothes and furniture at the hotel and offering to help however they could. The contractor finally gave us his full estimate after inspecting every inch of the house and said it would take at least 6 months and $200,000 to make it livable again. Insurance would cover maybe half if we were lucky, and we still owed $40,000 from the previous repairs that we'd put on credit cards and a home equity loan. He showed us pictures of the structural damage and said the foundation had shifted from all the water and the walls were full of mold and the electrical needed complete replacement. Dad had missed 8 days of work by then, and his boss called to say they needed to have a serious conversation about his commitment to the company. Dad tried to explain about the house and Grandma and the criminal case, but his boss kept saying the company needed reliability, and maybe Dad should consider whether this job was right for him anymore. The next week was the hearing for the Perry brothers, and Kaya only got probation and 200 hours of community service because she was the youngest and had cooperated fully. She showed up at our hotel room the next day, crying and saying Jerry had threatened to hurt her family if they didn't help, and she was only 17 and didn't know what else to do. Mom wouldn't even look at her, but I felt bad because she seemed genuinely sorry and scared, and said Jerry had been planning this for months, and picked our family specifically. The following Monday, Dad went to the office for a meeting he thought was about catching up on work, but his boss and someone from HR were waiting for him. They said his performance had been suffering for months, and with all the absences they had to let him go, but they'd give him 2 weeks severance and wouldn't contest unemployment benefits. Dad came back to the hotel room and just sat on the bed staring at nothing and didn't say a word for 3 hours while Mom rubbed his back and told him we'd figure it out somehow. Mom picked up extra shifts at the hospital the very next day and started working 16-hour days just to keep us in the hotel room. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning to her alarm going off, and she'd already be dressed in her scrubs making instant coffee with the tiny hotel coffee maker. She'd come back at 11 at night and collapse on the bed still wearing her shoes, and I'd have to pull them off while she was already snoring. One morning I found her standing at the counter with her eyes closed and the coffee pot overflowing onto the floor because she'd fallen asleep while it was brewing. She kept saying she was fine, but her hands shook all the time, and she put salt in her coffee twice that week thinking it was sugar. The memory care place called 3 days later, saying Grandma had gotten out again, and they'd found her at the bus station trying to buy a ticket to California with Monopoly money. The director said they couldn't keep her safe in the regular unit anymore, and she needed their secured wing, which cost $800 more per month, and Medicare wouldn't cover any of it. Dad threw his phone against the wall when he heard the price, and it shattered into pieces, which meant we had to share Mom's phone between the 3 of us. We drove out to see the secured unit, and it had keypads on every door and alarms on the windows, and looked more like a prison than a care home. Grandma was sitting in the common room wearing someone else's sweater and didn't recognize any of us when we walked in. A developer showed up at our burned house the next week while we were trying to salvage photo albums from the less damaged rooms. He walked around taking pictures and measuring things, and offered us $70,000 cash for the property, which was less than half what we owed on the mortgage. Dad said we couldn't possibly take that little, but the developer just shrugged and said the land was worth more than the house at this point, and we'd be lucky to get anything with all the damage. He left his card and said to call when we got desperate enough, which made Dad's face turn red and his fists clench, but he didn't say anything. The prosecutor called that afternoon to tell us Jerry's trial date was set for 6 months out, and warned us it could get pushed back even further if his lawyer filed motions. She said he was looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted on all the charges, but juries were unpredictable, and we should prepare ourselves for anything, including him walking free. I couldn't handle sitting in the hotel room anymore, watching my parents fall apart, so I walked to every fast food place within 2 miles and filled out applications. The manager at the burger place near the highway hired me on the spot when I explained our situation and said I could start the next day. He was this older guy named Frank who'd been through his own hard times and understood what it was like to need money right away. My first shift, he showed me how to work the fryer and register and let me take home a bag of leftover burgers and fries that would have been thrown out anyway. I brought them back to the hotel, and it was the first time I'd seen Dad smile in weeks as he ate a cold burger sitting on the edge of the bed. Harry from the insurance company finally called with what he called good news, but turned out to be another disappointment. They'd approved a settlement of $45,000, which sounded like a lot until the contractor explained it would only cover making the house structurally sound, but not actually livable. We could fix the foundation and frame, or we could do the electrical and plumbing, but not both, and definitely not the walls or floors or anything that would make it a real home again. Dad spent hours with a calculator, trying to figure out some way to make the money stretch, but the numbers never added up no matter how he arranged them. The sentencing for Luther and Colson happened on a Tuesday morning, and we all went to court to watch. The judge gave them each 18 months in county jail and said they were lucky to avoid state prison, but they'd made terrible choices following Jerry's lead. Luther's mom was crying in the gallery, and Colson just stared at his shoes while the bailiff put them in handcuffs. The prosecutor told us afterward that 18 months meant they'd probably serve 12 with good behavior, and Jerry's trial was still the one that really mattered. Mom's sister Beth called that night from Oregon, saying she had a spare bedroom and we could come stay with her as long as we needed. She said her husband had a construction company and could probably give Dad a job, and there was a good memory care place nearby for Grandma. Mom cried on the phone for 20 minutes saying she didn't want to be a burden, but Beth kept insisting family helped family, and we'd do the same for her. Dad sat at the little hotel desk making lists of pros and cons about moving to Oregon, and the cons list was basically just leaving everything we'd ever known behind. 3 days later, the memory care facility called at 2 a.m. saying Grandma had fallen in the bathroom and broken her hip. We rushed to the hospital and found her confused and scared and calling me by my uncle's name who'd been dead for 10 years. The orthopedic surgeon said she needed surgery, but her age and confusion made it risky, and there could be complications with the anesthesia. They also found she had a urinary tract infection which was making her confusion worse, and her blood pressure was dangerously high from the stress of everything. We sat in that waiting room for 6 hours while they operated, and Mom held Dad's hand the whole time, even though they'd barely spoken in days. When the surgeon came out, he said the surgery went well, but recovery would be long and difficult, and she might never walk normally again. That night back at the hotel, Dad finally broke down completely and started sobbing into his hands. He kept saying the kitchen lock was the stupidest thing he'd ever done, and he'd destroyed our whole life trying to save a few dollars on groceries. He said he was just trying to teach me responsibility and boundaries, but instead, he lost everything and ruined our family and put Grandma in danger and made us homeless. Mom found him like that the next morning, still sitting there with his face in his hands, and she wrapped her arms around him while they both cried. Word about our situation spread through the neighborhood faster than the fire had spread through our house, and by Saturday morning there were cars lining up outside the hotel. People we barely knew showed up with casseroles and sandwiches and bags of clothes their kids had outgrown. The church down the street organized a work party at our burned house, and when we drove over to see what was happening, there were 50 people hauling out charred furniture and ripping down damaged drywall. They had trucks and trailers and dumpsters, and everyone was working like it was their own house that needed saving. The contractor who'd given us the impossible estimate showed up with his whole crew and said they were donating their Saturday to help clear the debris. They saved anything that looked salvageable, putting Mom's surviving books in plastic bins and Dad's tools that Jerry's crew had dropped in a neat pile. People brought water and pizza for the workers, and someone set up a donation box that filled with cash by noon. The prosecutor called that afternoon to tell us Jerry had agreed to a plea deal for 12 years in prison. He'd have to pay $50,000 in restitution, but his lawyer admitted Jerry had no money and no assets, so we'd probably never see a penny of it. Mom said at least he couldn't hurt anyone else for a while, and Dad just nodded and went back to watching the cleanup crew work. 3 days later, Dad got a call from a guy who'd heard our story through the neighborhood gossip. He owned a small shipping company and needed someone to manage inventory, and while it paid less than Dad's old job, he said he understood about family emergencies and wouldn't fire someone for taking care of their family. Dad started the next Monday and came home that first night looking less defeated than he had in weeks. We sat down with the contractor, again, and this time he had a different plan. We could fix just enough to make the house sellable, patch the roof and stabilize the structure, and make it look decent from the street. He said he could do it in 2 months for $40,000, which was still more than we had, but at least possible with the insurance money and donations. Mom and Dad decided to sell as soon as the repairs were done, and use whatever we got to start over somewhere else. Meanwhile, Grandma's hip surgery went better than expected, though the doctor said she'd need months of physical therapy. The social worker at the hospital helped us find a non-profit care facility that charged based on income, and they had an opening in their memory care wing. Grandma seemed calmer there, with nurses who knew how to handle her confusion and a routine that kept her from wandering. The contractor worked fast, and by the end of 2 months the house looked decent from the outside, even if the inside was mostly just primer and plywood. We listed it on a Thursday, and by Saturday we had 3 offers. A young couple wanted it as a fixer-upper project, excited about making it their own, and they didn't even try to negotiate the price down. The closing happened fast, and suddenly we had enough money to pay off the remaining repair bills and put down deposits on a rental house across town. The rental was in a cheaper neighborhood, and the house was older and smaller than our old place, with creaky floors and windows that didn't quite close right. But it had regular locks that we could all open whenever we wanted, and the kitchen was accessible 24 hours a day. We moved in with just the donated furniture and clothes people had given us, but it felt more like home than the hotel ever did. Mom found a therapist who specialized in couples dealing with crisis, and she convinced Dad to go with her. They went every Tuesday night, and slowly they started talking to each other again, instead of just existing in the same space. The therapist helped them see how their need to control everything had created most of our problems, how the kitchen lock was just a symptom of bigger issues they'd been ignoring. School had been rough with everything going on, but my teachers were understanding about late assignments and missed classes. When it came time to write college essays, I wrote about the kitchen lock and everything that happened after. The admissions counselor at the state university called it one of the most compelling essays she'd ever read, and they offered me a partial scholarship that would cover most of tuition. I graduated in June, with decent grades despite everything, and Mom cried through the whole ceremony while Dad took pictures with his phone. We visited Grandma every Sunday at the care facility, and slowly she started having more good days than bad ones. Sometimes she'd recognize us right away and ask about the house, and other times she'd think I was her brother or Dad was her father. But one Sunday she was completely clear, and when I told her the whole story about the kitchen lock and everything that followed, she laughed until she had tears in her eyes. She looked at Dad and said he'd always been too stubborn for his own good, even as a kid, always thinking he knew best about everything. Dad actually smiled and said he'd learned his lesson about trying to control things that didn't need controlling. The rental house became our new normal, with everyone coming and going as they pleased and nobody worrying about locks or schedules or rules about when someone could eat. Dad spent the next weekend installing smart home stuff all over the rental house, but this time he kept explaining how we could all control everything from our phones and how the motion sensors were for actual safety, not for catching me sneaking around. He showed me the app 3 times to make sure I understood how to turn off the alarm if I needed to get up at night, and even gave Grandma a simplified tablet that just had big buttons for lights and emergency calls. The doorbell camera caught the mailman delivering a thick envelope from the state prison 2 weeks later, and when I opened it, there was a handwritten letter from Jerry saying he was sorry for everything and that he'd started going to addiction meetings and was trying to get his life together. Mom grabbed it from my hands and threw it straight into the trash while muttering about how sorry doesn't fix anything. But after she went to work, I dug it out and stuck it in my desk drawer, because sometimes you need reminders of how bad things can get. The insurance company sent another letter a month later, but this one had a check for $10,000 attached, because their auditor found mistakes in the original claim assessment that meant we should have gotten more money for the fire damage. Dad actually laughed when he saw it and said, maybe our luck was finally turning around. Then he drove straight to the bank to deposit it before they could change their minds. We started eating dinner together every night at 6:30, all 4 of us around the small kitchen table in the rental, and nobody mentioned rules or curfews or locked kitchens anymore. Sometimes Dad would joke about my midnight snacking costing less than 1 insurance deductible, and we'd all laugh even though it wasn't really that funny, just better than crying about everything we'd lost. His boss at the new job called him into the office 3 months after he started, and I thought he was getting fired again, but instead they promoted him to regional manager because of how well he handled crisis situations. Dad came home with a cake from the grocery store and said the disaster with our house had prepared him for anything corporate could throw at him, and at least spreadsheets didn't catch fire or flood basements. Mom had saved a box of her first edition books that were in the upstairs closet when the basement flooded, and she finally got them appraised by a collector who came to the house with white gloves and a magnifying glass. He offered $30,000 for the whole set, because apparently one of them was a super rare printing with a typo that made it worth way more than the corrected version, and Mom signed the papers right there before he could reconsider. That money went straight into a new savings account that nobody could touch except for real emergencies, not the fake emergencies we used to have like running out of name-brand cereal or needing new tennis shoes. I still got up for midnight snacks because my body was permanently programmed to wake up hungry, but now I sent messages to our family group chat whenever I noticed something weird like strange noises or water where it shouldn't be. Last week the toilet was making a gurgling sound at 2 in the morning, so I texted everyone and Dad actually got up to check it and found the pipe was about to back up, which he fixed with a plunger before it became another disaster. He thanked me for catching it and said my weird sleep schedule had saved us from another insurance claim, which was probably the first time he'd ever been grateful for my snacking habits. We were doing better as a family, even though nothing was perfect, and we still had problems like everyone else. The house we'd lived in for 15 years was gone forever and belonged to that young couple now who posted pictures on social media of all their renovation projects. Grandma needed professional care that cost more than Dad made in a month, but at least she was safe and had good days where she knew who we were. We still owed about $40,000 in various debts from all the disasters, but the payment plans were manageable, and nobody was threatening to sue us anymore. The rental house had drafty windows and a furnace that sounded like a jet engine and floors that sloped toward the middle, but it had one thing our old house never had, which was a kitchen that stayed open all night long. Sometimes I'd find Dad in there at 3 in the morning making a sandwich, and he'd just nod at me like it was totally normal for both of us to be awake eating cold cuts in our pajamas. Mom started sleeping better once she stopped worrying about controlling everything, and even bought a big jar that she labeled Midnight Snack Fund, where we all threw our spare change. The whole experience taught us that trying to control everything actually controls nothing, and that sometimes the things you think are problems are actually the solutions to problems you don't even know you have yet. Kinda wild, right? Everyone's suddenly super helpful now, but when things were actually falling apart, they were nowhere to be found. Funny how that works. Like the video, it helps more than you think.